Hello and welcome to the Northern Saga Russian History Podcast. I'm Alexander.
And I'm Philip.
And today we will be discussing a very interesting topic indeed, which is possibly the most famous person of Russian history and most likely the second most famous Alexander of all time.
Yes, and of course, before we begin, we have a little disclaimer here. We are just two students doing this for fun, and we are in no way experts on the topic at hand. We just like Russian history and we like discussing it. If you want to correct us, then feel free to do so in a constructive manner.
Yes, or a destructive one, if that is what you prefer.
Yeah, we like to think of ourselves as thick-skinned, so hit us with the worst.
Alright, so who is this Aleksander Nevsky we're talking about? Well, his actual name is Alexander Yaroslavich, which is, and he was born in the year 1219 in a village called Pereslavl-Zalesky in Vladimir. And, well, let's get a bit of context in here, right?
Right.
So this is medieval Rus, but this is past, like, the legendary time of Oleg and Igor and Rurik. Yeah. At this point, they're very firmly Slavic and very firmly Christian.
Right.
There's not very much left of the sort of Norse heritage.
So there's very little paganism and...
paganism is basically dead,
right.
or been turned into a syncretic faith in some parts of the country. And Alexander is born into House Rurikovich, which is obviously the descendants of Rurik and his clan, who essentially rule over all of Kievan Rus. But unlike other medieval states, like, I don't know, France, England, the Kievan Rus isn't one state ruled by a single leader, even though at some point they might have pretended that it was. It was actually a series of principalities and cities who were sort of loosely aligned in language and customs. And, you know, sometimes someone would declare themselves Grand Prince of Kiev and they would be recognized, but they didn't really have control.
Right.
So they were fairly wealthy, did a lot of trade, but at this point the Byzantine Empire was kind of going down the drain, so because of the whole sack of Constantinople by the old Crusader boys.
Right.
And that was their main trade route. So with Constantinople sacked, Kiev was declining significantly. And generally things weren't that nice.
Yeah.
But in isolated villages, people lived a decent life. They had pretty good farmland. They could grow a lot of crops. Now, but this wasn't the end of the fun for Kiev and the rest of Kievan Rus, because not only was Constantinople sacked by the Crusader, but also some guys on horses led by a certain person who liked to ride a horse.
Right.
Came from the east. I think you know what I'm talking about.
My man Genghis, yeah.
Yeah. So Genghis Khan, the great conqueror Temujin, he brought forth the Mongol hordes upon, most of the world, and people were pretty distraught about the whole getting burned, sacked, and pillaged.
Right, as you do.
As you do. So when the Mongols arrived in Kiev, I don't recall the exact details, but let's just say the people of Kiev were like, "Here's some guys on horses. What are you gonna do?
Right.
We are the mighty city-state of Kiev."
Yeah.
This is of course a little while after the birth of Alexander Nevsky, but it's in 1240 and he is born in 1219. So if you do some quick maths, he's 21 years old.
Right.
And the Mongols are like, well, let us show you what we do, and they pillage Kiev. So if Kiev was doing poorly before, now it's doing even worse.
Right.
So essentially, this is a very interesting part of Russian history, because at this point the dominance in Russia goes from dominance in Kievan Rus territory goes from the south to the north.
Yeah.
Because the south is burned to the ground by the Mongols, and the previously very rich principalities of Kiev and Galicia, Volhynia, which today is Poland, or Ukraine. No, today's Ukraine.
Yeah.
Point is, the wealth and, the dominance over the principalities moved from the south to the north, not because the north got any richer, but because the south got burned to the ground.
Right, exactly.
Yes. And this is also basically where the modern divide between Russians and Ukrainians started. Because the people in what is today Ukraine would live directly under Mongol rule, while the people in Russia would kind of just pay lip service to the Mongols.
Right, so Ukrainians are basically weaker Russians.
Well,
you did not hear us say that.
You're not. Disavow. One could say that Ukrainians are Slavs with Mongol characteristics.
Okay, let's move on.
We disavow everything we just said. No point. So, let's go back to Alexander Yaroslavich.
Let's hope no Ukrainian watches this.
We apologize to all Ukrainians listening, all 0.1 of you.
It's all in good faith. Ukrainians have all the right to call us Mongolia.
Moving swiftly on.
Right.
So, he is of course a noble, and he is fourth in the line to the throne of Vladimir. And Vladimir is a fairly rich principality. I mean, it's like not bad, not great, sort of in the middle.
Right.
And to everyone's surprise, he gets elected. Well, for one thing, when he's 18 years old, the Mongols decide to pay a little visit to Vladimir, the city, which forms the namesake for the city-state. And they didn't learn from Kiev, so they're like, well, what are some Asians on horses going to do? So the Mongols, they try to sack Vladimir, and according to the chronicles, Vladimir, being only 18 years old, like any 18-year-old Russian at the time, he rushes to fight these Mongols, and despite being fairly successful, like you could say he earns a bit of respect from his peers and from the Mongols, even though Vladimir probably got more or less sacked, but he got to show how great fighter he was.
Exactly.
And now the boyars, the nobles, they're like, okay, I'm pretty sure all the other possible heirs to the throne of Vladimir are terrible, and this Alexander guy looks great, like all Alexanders, as I can testify.
Okay, that's debatable, but okay, moving on.
Not debatable. So, in a surprising turn of events, he gets elected to be Prince of Vladimir.
Yeah. Oh, but by the boyars.
By the boyars.
Right.
It's not democracy.
No.
Because Kievan Rus' succession laws was basically whatever the boyars felt like at the time.
Right, exactly. So they didn't follow any typical monarchic succession laws that we see today. Or
they technically did, but
right, exactly. So
like if the boyars thought the next in line candidate was terrible, they'll just choose another one.
Oh, okay, like that.
And different principalities had different succession laws.
Okay.
And
so,
almost all of these are Rurikoviches, right, at this point.
Right.
So, I mean, most of the Russian nobility has sort of been intermingled. So this is just internal family disputes, kind of.
Exactly.
So it's not like another dynasty is getting power.
Right.
So he gets elected, and he becomes Prince of Vladimir, and has or Grand Prince to be more specific. And maybe it's a bit relevant to note how his father died. He was poisoned while visiting the Great Khan of the Mongols.
By the Great Khan?
Probably. I'm unsure of the details, but this is the sort of relationship between the Mongols and the East Slavs, I should say. There's no such thing as Russian or Ukrainian at this point. There's just East Slav. Right. And technically there's a lot of tribes, but we just call them East Slavs. Now, Alexander, he decides that, I liked fighting the Mongols, but we're not going to win a war against them. So he kind of starts to buddy up with the Mongols. Right. Because he's playing 4D chess, as I'm going to explain later.
Yeah, because it seems a little weird to team up with those who you've been fighting.
And who poisoned his father, but, he got the throne, so,
Yeah, I mean, I guess, his call.
Yeah. But he realizes that, the scattered principalities of Rus have literally no chance against these well-organized Mongol hordes. And I mean, if you start to get into the details of, military doctrine and tactics of the time, the Rus tactics were very poorly matched against Mongols, because they didn't really build that many castles. They relied on, lightly armed armies of peasants, which don't do well against horse archers.
Yeah, but weren't Mongolians like essential, or not the same in like that they were peasants, but in terms of equipment, I'd say.
Yes, but the Mongolians had one thing that the Russians didn't have, or the East Slavs, and that was a horse.
Right.
Because only the nobility would have a horse in Kievan Rus.
Oh, okay.
So
no, because when I think of Aleksander Nevsky, I think of him being on a horse.
Yeah,
because I watched that movie.
Of course,
Yeah.
a very famous movie. But he would ride on a horse. His personal guard would ride on horses, but the common soldier would not have a horse.
Right, exactly.
But in the Mongol armies, even though not every single soldier had a horse, a pretty large percentage of them had a horse, and they knew how to use it.
Exactly.
Because they had horses in abundance, and they were very skilled with them.
Yeah.
So moving swiftly on, this isn't the end of the troubles for Russia, or for Kievan Rus. In the north, you have a principality called Novgorod, which has sort of established a separate identity from Kiev, and this has been going on for a long time. And while the Mongols kind of didn't really bother Novgorod, because Novgorod is kind of in the north and it's snow and cold, and horses don't do that well when it's really cold and snowy and icy.
Yeah.
So Novgorod didn't really have a problem with the Mongols, but it did have a problem with the people they descended from, in a way, the Swedes.
Yeah.
Because the Swedes wanted to expand on around the river Neva. I wonder where this has become relevant. Foreshadowing. So the Swedish king, he raises an enormous army, and he lands on Kievan Rus lands in near the river Neva, and he sends basically a message to the rulers of Novgorod and tells them, "Fight me if you want. I've already landed my armies on your soil."
Right.
Which is like a medieval equivalent of just flexing.
Yeah.
So the Novgorodians like, okay, we're not that good fighters. We just prefer just trading and freezing to death. And they see this very competent commander who is the ruler of Vladimir, and they say, "We'll make you a prince of Novgorod if you lead our armies against the Swedes."
Yeah.
And Alexander, being the how should I say, excitable and adventurous person he is, obviously says yes. And he has become quite a good leader and commander at this point. So he has a little think, a big think, and he says, so the Swedes outnumber us, and the Novgorodians have not raised an army, and raising an army at this point is an extremely long and tiresome process. So the Swedish king, who coincidentally was known as the Swedish king who established Stockholm, not that that's particularly relevant in this case,
Right.
but he knows it'll be a while until the Novgorodians can mount an army to attack him, so he doesn't really bother organizing his troops that much. He rather prepares for a long campaign.
Yeah.
Of course, as we well know, invading Russia in the winter or invading Russia at all is not a very good idea.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme amongst world powers, yeah. Except if you're Mongol.
Yeah, I mean, the Mongols, one could say that they kind of invaded Ukraine and left. They didn't really full-on invade Russia.
Yeah, but...
Yeah, okay, details.
Yeah.
Point is, and Alexander is like, he's a bit impatient. So he tells his druzhina, his bodyguard, grab your horses, grab your swords, and he just walks through the streets of Novgorod and just tells the common folk to just grab your swords and pitchforks and come with me.
Right.
Which is, frankly, not a very good way to raise an army, but I suppose he was pretty inspirational, and he gathered a sizable force of mostly peasants, but spearheaded by his druzhina, which I believe that word is derived from the word for fellowship and also a word for drugs, which is...
drug.
Yeah.
Yeah, friendship.
Yeah, it's both friendship, but it's also referring to... I'm not sure, but I think that word both refers to friendship and an old Slavic word for narcotics. Or
Really?
like intoxicants.
What language are you talking about? This is like some proto...
Yeah, old Slavic.
Yeah, like...
Old.
Yeah.
But that's anecdotal. I have no source on that.
Yeah.
But so he takes this peasant force, which, despite rallying the common folk, he's still severely outnumbered by the Swedes. And these are poorly trained peasants. I mean, they're Kievan Rus peasants who are pretty used to fighting, so not like the worst, but
Right.
pretty bad.
Yeah, relatively bad.
But what he essentially does is prepare an ambush against the Swedish king, who is not expecting an attack, because he's like, it takes ages to raise an army, especially in like the largest territory on Earth, or in terms of collective being known as one entity, if you understand.
Yeah.
So he essentially ambushes the Swedes with his peasants from a forest where they're least expecting them, and the Swedes are caught completely off guard. And then he charges his družina into the rear in order to duel with the king of Sweden, obviously, as you do. And there are a lot of accounts of this story, but he allegedly very famously managed to wound the Swedish king with his spear. And the Swedes were like, we've had enough of this, we're going home.
Right.
And this made him extremely popular, because he had just won what appeared to be an unwinnable victory against the Swedish invaders. And had the Swedes won, that would probably have changed the course of history forever.
Exactly.
Because yes, even though they did take back the territory later, they weren't able to further advance into Kievan Rus territory, and Novgorod continued to be a relevant force. So at this point, Novgorod, the leaders of Novgorod, they let him continue to be a prince, but they're not a huge fan of his popularity, because he's so popular against the common folk, and they're like, okay, those guys were just trading and hiding in their houses while he fought the foreign invaders.
Yeah.
So they essentially just try to push him away from power. They send him back to Vladimir.
Yeah.
So, and then they're like, finally we have peace and we can trade and do whatever Novgorodians did at this point. Of course, things aren't that easy, because there's a fundamental problem religiously, which is that Kievan Rus followed the Eastern Orthodox faith.
Yeah.
And most of Europe, including everyone's favorite pope, followed Catholicism.
Yeah.
And their only Eastern Orthodox ally.
A bit of too much chemistry, right?
Yeah. Their only Eastern Orthodox ally, the Byzantine Empire, had sort of been what little was left was cut in two by Catholic crusaders.
Yeah.
And not even flex tape could fix that.
Right.
Yeah. So they were sort of alone, and the Pope was like, well, we've converted the pagans of Prussia by sending the Teutonic and Livonian Order of Knights, who, did their old slaughtering thing, and then suddenly everyone became a lot more Christian. It's amazing.
Right.
They converted Prussia, Lithuania, and attempted to convert Estonia and Latvia, who were historically been pagan. And of course they had previously converted a lot of the Slavic pagans in Europe, and they were sort of running out of people to convert in Europe.
Yep.
So Kievan Rus was very wealthy in resources, so they were like, wouldn't that be a great Catholic ally? So and the Pope specifically attempted to create conflict between the Mongol Khan and the principalities of Kievan Rus, because he knew that if they were under threat by the Mongols, they would be more willing to accept Catholicism in order to save themselves.
Right.
And this is where the 4D chess comes in, because Alexander, he knows that a fight between the Mongols and the principalities of Kievan Rus will empower Catholicism, whereas at this moment their main the Mongols are demanding tribute from the people of Rus, but other than that, they kind of will just leave them alone.
Yeah.
But if they succumb to the Catholics, they will fundamentally change their culture and religion, which will irrevocably change their society.
Whose society?
Kievan Rus society.
Right.
So Alexander sees this, and he realizes that it's smarter to just give some resources to the Mongols and just be left alone by them. But of course the Pope, he doesn't really like this whole buddying, and he decides to take things into his own hands and sends the Livonian Order of Knights.
Right.
Now, for a bit of context, we mentioned previously how the armies of Kievan Rus are mainly peasants. Yes, and also they did have armored and skilled troops, but they were in few in number, the Druzhina.
Yeah.
While the Livonian knights, these guys were clad in, like, at this point, plate armor, right? Heavily armored with horses, or a very large percentage of cavalry in their armies,
Right.
and with very good equipment and training. So these armies had wiped the field with a lot larger pagan armies because, you know, a soldier and horse is the equivalent of several untrained peasants on foot.
Right.
And it's very hard to deal with full plate armor, particularly when you haven't really embraced crossbows that much, most likely. And this is before the age of gunpowders.
Yeah.
So he decides that it should be an easy victory for the Livonian order over the Eastern Slavs.
Yeah.
So he dispatches an army led by a prince bishop into Novgorodian lands. And the merchants, or like the important people in Novgorod, they're like, oh, not this again. And they're like, hey, Alexander, you know how we kicked you out?
Yeah.
Would you mind coming back and defending our country?
Jesus, how the tables have turned.
I mean, at this point, they know that they're officially relinquishing all their power in favor of Alexander.
Yeah.
Because they threw him out. He's not going to accept anything except their total surrender.
Yeah.
But it's better that to get better that than to be burned at the stake by a bunch of angry metal-clad Christian boys.
Right, exactly.
Who are very sexually repressed and therefore extremely angry.
Yeah, right. Well, are these the Teutonic Knights that we saw in the Alexander? Yeah.
The Livonian Order is a subset of the Teutonic Order.
Right.
But the Teutonics were the main Teutonic Order was concentrated in Prussia, while the Livonian Order was concentrated in the Baltics. And while they were on paper the same knightly order, they operated very differently.
Right.
But they're usually referred to as Teutonic Knights in common culture.
Yeah, right.
Because, you know, Teutonic makes you think German, which is what these were. They were Germans mostly, German invaders.
Yeah.
I mean,
German invaders in Russia.
I almost like it's foreshadowing.
Yeah.
Now, so Alexander has a bit of a problem now.
Yeah.
Is that he has his Druzhina, he has his peasant levies, but how is he going to defeat these very angry Germans with full plate armor and horses? So he devises a cunning plan that involves using nature and general winter.
Right.
You know, foreshadowing.
You know, as always, you know.
So, I neglected to mention this, but previously he had success with luring Swedes onto the ice.
Yeah.
Because the Russians most likely had a lot more experience fighting on ice, and they were more lightly armored also, which gives you an advantage when it's very slippery and you have a chance of coming crashing through the ice and freezing to death.
Exactly.
Yeah. So what he does is he lures the Teutonic Knights into the country in like a very typical maneuver onto an ice, a frozen lake, very famously depicted in the movie.
Yeah, the battle on the ice.
Yeah, and they're not expecting to be attacked. They are on the offensive. They believe they're running down the Slavs. They believe that, you know, we're winning.
Right.
So when he suddenly turns around and attacks them on the ice, they're like, hold on there. This isn't the way it's supposed to go.
Right.
And as you may know, heavy cavalry is usually extremely effective. But in ice, surrounded by forests...
Yeah, I mean, I don't really see how like the hooves of the horses are going to fare well in the ice.
They hadn't invented horse skating yet, so
right.
There's a bit of a problem.
Yeah.
So essentially, all their advantages are null and void here, and they of course are fewer in number because of how well trained and equipped they are. They can't field as many soldiers as these Slavs. So Alexander attacks, and there's this famous battle on the ice, where of course this is probably not true, but it's very famously depicted that the weight of the Teutonics were forced to dismount their horses. And very often the weight of their armor and or their horses caused them to come crashing through the ice and freeze to death, which is frankly a pretty terrible way.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that like on the list of worst ways to die, I'd say like freezing to death while drowning isn't
Yeah.
really a.
Yeah, and this is also foreshadowing because almost 1,000 years later, a lot of Germans are going to be drowning inside metal in Russia as well, except a slightly different type of metal.
Yeah, right.
It's almost as if history repeats itself somewhat.
Yeah, I mean, we see that now, the annexation of a foreign country, the rise of nationalism,
Yeah.
economic protectionism.
But we're just history enthusiasts. We can't comment on that.
Right, exactly. But there's also a pandemic raging on right now, so
Yeah.
Who would have known?
Okay, but back to the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
So now Aleksander Nevsky has defeated the Teutonic Knights. He has destroyed a fundamental existential threat to the Eastern Slavs and to their way of living.
Yep.
And he is essentially the most famous guy in all of the Kievan Rus land. Right? He's like, or at least what's left of it after the Mongols had their way. And essentially he becomes the leader of Novgorod.
Yep.
And becomes the dominant figure in Kievan Rus politics. So despite not directly controlling all of the territory, he can basically tell them what to do.
Yeah.
And this is the first time in a while that a descendant of Rurik has had so much power and influence in the land of Kievan Rus. And of course, and in a way, united North and South Novgorod with what remains of Kiev and the surrounding areas.
Right.
So now that he's until his death, he was surprisingly peaceful after this. His main goals were befriending the Mongols and maintaining a tributary relationship.
Right.
And the reason for this was, of course, discussed earlier, and it gave him a very big advantage over a lot of other people who dealt with the Mongols, because he paid tribute, but on his terms.
Oh.
So, for instance,
Wait, how does that work? How does that does not make sense?
Well, the thing is, he's basically telling them, well, I'm willingly paying tribute to you. You don't have to fight me. In return, I want this, because he knows that he can that they can fight, but they have seen of his great military victories. They respect him.
Right.
They know it will be bloody. So, and they don't have that much interest in the frozen wasteland that is Kievan Rus.
Right.
So he's essentially playing 4D chess, as previous. So he manages to give Kievan Rus notable privileges among the tributaries of the Mongol Empire, or the Golden Horde. Where, for instance, they did not have to send soldiers to the Mongol armies. That's a pretty big one, because, as you know, the Mongol armies are pretty big and constantly expanding. And he was allowed. The Mongols recognized the role of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and they were allowed to freely practice their faith and even build new churches in almost Mongol-controlled area.
Right.
Of course, this came at the cost that he had to, whenever individual princes would rise up against the Mongols, he would have to be the one to squash them. Because if not, it would ruin his entire special relationship with the Mongols. And, he basically continued this. This, of course, is 200 years before the end of the Tatar yoke, which is the tributary relationship, but it did build the foundation for Novgorod and Muscovy, or the rise of Novgorod and Muscovy as the two major principalities, uniting all the ones around them, which eventually set the groundwork for the unification of Russia.
Right.
Had Russia been burned to the ground by the Mongols, probably wouldn't have been as likely. Because you could, for instance, compare the southern lands with northern lands. The northern lands developed powerful principalities, which eventually united. Well, in the southern lands, they were merely conquered by foreign power, which was the Grand Duchy of Lithuania.
Yeah.
And because there was really very little wealth left in the area. So this is why Russia has existed for hundreds of years and Ukraine has existed for 100 years.
Right.
Not that means anything for the legitimacy of the nations, mind you, but
but like just
it just shows why Aleksander Nevsky is so important, even though what he did was win 2 battles and befriend some Mongols, right? Which was his main accomplishment. But the point is that through doing this, he set the groundwork for the end of the Tatar yoke and the unification of Russia later.
Right.
Because he saw what he had, which was a bunch of fragmented principalities who fighting amongst each other and couldn't really agree on anything, versus an overwhelming force.
Yeah.
So he took the decision that he had to make. And of course, afterwards, when he died, and later when the Kievan Rus, or what gradually transformed into the Russians, started fighting the Mongols, they dug up his bones and used them as a blessing.
Oh.
I mean,
this sounds a bit pagan to
it's
me.
very Eastern Orthodox.
Yeah, but it sounds a bit pagan too.
What? No. You're saying this. Hey, it's not pagan if it's a saintly relic, because I didn't mention this, but he got canonized, and he's probably one
as a saint.
Yeah, as a saint. He is technically Saint Aleksander Nevsky.
Right. Okay.
And not only did he get canonized, but he also got an order of the military named after him.
Yeah.
The Order of Aleksander Nevsky. Well, obviously.
Yeah, right.
And he also has one of the most famous medals in the Tsarist, which became Soviet, which became Russian military.
Right.
Which is...
So it's interesting to see that even his legacy transcends any political barriers.
Yeah, and I think it's very, very with Nevsky, compared to Peter the Great, as we discussed in another episode, while his actual accomplishments were maybe, I should say, smaller, his impact was much, much larger.
Right.
So there I think it's particularly relevant to just notice impact, particularly in a lot later and closer to modern times, where he basically became a symbol of national resistance in the Second World War.
Exactly. Yeah, we saw that with the famous movie, the titular movie Aleksander Nevsky.
Yes.
Yeah, in which not only like in terms of cinematography and just in general movie making was a very progressive piece at the time. It also managed to, I'd say, to a very large, or maybe not a large extent, but at least it rallied like this national sentiment of resistance.
It's established a narrative of us versus them, which was very, very powerful.
Exactly. It was made even more powerful considering the adversaries were Germans.
Yeah.
And like the resistors, they were us, the Russians.
Yeah, and it's obvious why the Soviet Union brought also back the Eastern Orthodox faith during the war.
Right.
Because the Eastern Orthodox faith became a symbol of resistance. The Eastern Orthodox Russian versus at this point, I don't know what the Nazis believed, some sort of weird occult stuff, but they were mainly like not Eastern Orthodox.
Right, exactly.
So in a way, it became, in an atheist state, it became a religious conflict, which is very interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, you see that even now, like people referred to it back then and even now as a sacred. Yeah. As a sacred war. That's what it's called.
Yeah, wasn't that officially in Soviet propaganda also called the Sacred War?
Yeah, exactly. And there's this really famous like song, the Sacred War, and they played it on Soviet parades, and they play it now on Russian parades. It's you really see religious undertones in this throughout the entire ordeal.
And if you compare it to other cultures, for instance, the Battle on the Ice was as defining for the Russians as the Battle of Teutoburg Forest was for the Germans.
Right.
Because in the same way, the Battle of Teutoburg Forest established us versus them, the Latins versus the Germans. Here was sort of the opposite, the Germans versus the Russians.
Right. It's also interesting to think like how... because the odds were against Aleksander Nevsky, and
yes.
Call it luck, call it genius. It's I'd say it's a miracle that he even won the battle.
Yes, I mean, and he was a saint. I suppose I don't know if it's a Catholic thing, but you need like 2 miracles to become a saint. I guess they could count his victories as miracles.
Yeah, I guess
that kind of works.
Yeah, but what I'm trying to say is like, it's interesting to think that if he failed, and like given the circumstances, I'd expect him to fail.
Yeah.
Like how would the world look like today? We maybe see like a Catholic Russia, or maybe
if he had failed, I think we'd see
or many Catholic disjointed Slavic tribes or something.
If he had failed, we'd probably see a Russia that's closer to the Baltics or the Ukraine, which had very much outside influence, Germans in the Baltics and the Lithuanians, later Poles in the Ukraine. Well, because of his victory, the Russians, or what would become the Russians, were able to stand on their own, and he sort of became a symbol of victory against untenable odds.
Right.
And that also was very important for Muscovy and later Russia, who was continuously under attack by their neighbors. But they were like, no, we're gonna win. We have the resilience of the Slavic people.
Exactly. So, in a way, like maybe him being defeated at the battle would have led to like a less nationalistic or even a less unified sentiment among the Slavs.
Yeah.
Yeah. And as such, maybe I would probably see more influence from both the West and the East then.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And maybe, the Mongols would still exist today and not have been reduced to nothing by glorious Russian armies.
Exactly. So we would probably see a much less unified, not only Russia, but just Slavs in general.
Yeah, because he was a symbol of national unity. Before this, there wasn't really before Nevsky, there wasn't really a common Kievan Rus identity. There was sort of like a confederation of tribes and villages.
Right.
I mean, sure, you had the Rus, the Rurikids, who were like a unifying force, but when they started fighting amongst each other, that sort of just didn't work anymore. So, while the best way to unify people is to give them a common enemy and give them a hero to look up to.
Right.
Yeah, and that is effectively what Aleksander Nevsky achieved.
Exactly.
So, definitely parts of the story are exaggerated, are legend, are made up to make him look better. But the fact of the matter is that he was a very impressive person, and just shows just how good job Alexanders have done throughout history.
I sense a little bias there.
I'm not biased at all.
Right. Well, so I guess this is it then.
Yeah, I think that's almost what I had to say, and we hope that you have enjoyed listening, besides our very offensive jokes. Sorry, Ukrainians.
Yeah, we should maybe edit that one out. Should we edit it out? Or...
No, it's more fun this way.
Yeah, okay, sure.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, of course, we don't mean what they say about the Ukrainians. It's just a bit of laughs. We're both Russian, if it wasn't clear enough.
Slightly biased here.
Yeah, so we're slightly biased, but come on, we love our Ukrainians as much as they love us.
Yes.
We probably love them more than they love us, but still.
It's a bit of a love-hate relationship.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I mean, current politics notwithstanding.
I mean, and it's weird that entire relationship can be dated back to Nevsky, the Mongol invasion.
Right.
Which basically split up the Eastern Slavs in these very definable groups.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Hope you enjoyed listening. Don't trust anything we say, and have a nice day.
Yeah, have a nice day in these trying times.